I forgot to turn on my microphone. Anyway, so today I want to talk about tech. It's going to be a random grab bag of things that I want to talk about, but mostly just. I don't mostly focus on monopolies, but before we get into the monopolies, I just want to comment about my thoughts of what Apple is planning with its new M1 chips and where, in my mind at least, that industry should head towards. So, the M1 chip that Apple announced, what was it, last week or so, is interesting, right? It's powerful enough, at least in synthetic benchmarks, to be completely overwhelming compared to the competition. And this is competition that's been working on these same desktop grade chips for 20, no, what am I even saying, 40, 50 years. And so it's interesting that a newcomer, well, relative newcomer at least to desktop performance, can wring so much out of an architecture that no one else seems to be able to do, and that's very interesting. So the M1 chip, it's powerful enough to outperform a lot of medium tier combo chipsets, like laptops that you would get for $1,000, give or take, and outperform them by a relatively large margin. And the M1 chip itself is actually derived from the A14 chips that are, or we assume they're derived from the A14 chips that are powerful enough to run, the latest iPhones and the iPad Airs. And so that got me thinking, in those same synthetic benchmarks that we saw, the A14 chips already outperform certain desktop chips. And so that seems to imply then that the A14 SoCs that are in the iPad Air and the iPhones are themselves powerful enough to run essentially what is desktop grade macOS, OS 11, because apparently we no longer call it OS X or OS 10. So if that means that the iPad Air 4 itself is already has the capability to run macOS, then doesn't that really imply that for next year's iPad Pro refresh that we're looking at, at least for me, it would be interesting if that particular model got a derivative of the M1 chip that is now in the MacBook Airs and Mac Minis and all of that, because that would mean that suddenly instead of instead of the iPad Pro being a mobile first tablet, suddenly it's competing directly on the Microsoft Surface level, which is a full-fledged professional tablet with desktop grade components and desktop grade abilities. And so that, to me at least, that is something that I've been dreaming of since they originally announced the iPad, the 9-inch first generation iPad Pro, which I have myself actually. And so that's interesting, right? And so what can we expect from the M1 going forward? Well, I want it in an iPad Pro, but more generally, it seems like it's a very well positioned to go on to be in the later, or not later, what am I saying, the higher end models of the iMacs, the iMac Pros, even Mac Pros themselves. And to me, there doesn't actually need to be much change within the M1, though I'm sure they'll do enough of that. But because Apple controls the entire stack, so fundamental hardware, the middleware, operating system, and all of that, it suddenly means that unlike modern day desktops where the integrated graphics are no longer used on a the integrated graphics are no longer used when you add a discrete card on the M1 on the Apple Silicon Macs. They would definitely be used. There's no reason for them not to be in use, and so I could definitely envision this kind of hybrid solution where on higher tier Macs, instead of re-engineering the M1 or trying to make the chip bigger by adding more graphics onto the same chip, very well they could take some PCIe lanes and dedicate that towards a specific, I'll call it a graphics accelerator. And so essentially it would dramatically improve the graphics performance and also use all of the hardware that is already on the board itself. And really you can only do that when you are like Apple and you have complete integration of the stack. And I'm sure that's where Intel is going with the launch of its own discrete Xe graphics line, or I hope that's what they're doing, because otherwise what a waste of time that would be. Anyway, so back to what I was saying at the very beginning. I hope that the M1 chip means that we will have a rather interesting iPad Pro come next year, and desperately wish I could get one. Anyway, so that's it. Oh yeah, also, with macOS 11, they're doing a whole bunch of optimizations for touch interfaces. So obviously, we're gonna see that within the next 2 years. That's just gonna be a given. But really, this talk was mainly to be focused on monopolies, and not, of course, the game, which itself was made by communists, but rather monopolies that exist in the tech industry today. And we tend to think of Apple as a monopoly because it is so well or so tightly vertically integrated that it's able to do essentially all of these very interesting things and do them at a scale that we've never seen before. And while that is certainly, we could consider that a monopoly within Apple's own walled garden, and certainly there are enough companies that think so, and enough regulators that think so, that they are currently, having fun with lawyers everywhere. Apple itself, at least to me, is not the most insidious of the tech companies, just simply because it doesn't try to hide what it's trying to do. To me, the worst offender really is still, and has been for a few years now, the other one, right? And of course, I'm just faking not knowing the name, because who knows what name they'll go by soon. I'm sorry, I laugh at my own thoughts. So Google, well, the main conceit, or my main argument for why I dislike Google more is just because they are much less, at least as a company in development, they hide and are much less open about how walled their garden is. And sure, we can talk about Android being able to sideload, etc., etc. But that is, strictly speaking, not the point, because we can still sideload on Apple. That's not the end of the world. You can, as a developer, if you want to make your customers jump through hoops to install something on an iPhone, that's very much possible. Just like you would have to jump through hoops to install stuff on your Android devices. So what really makes it more disingenuous, at least for Google, is the idea that they hide behind open source. The claims of open source for Google are all very, very interesting and very, very much in the spirit of what the internet is, or freedom of information, blah blah blah, all of that, very interesting, and just general freedom. And yet, if you actually look closer at what's happening, that's not really the case. And so when people complain, Google can always sort of retreat into it. But look, it's open source. Anyone can fork it and do whatever they want with it. But can they really? Like, if someone wanted to fork Android and make money off a forked version of Android, can they really do that? And to me, the answer is no, unless they are Amazon. And that's for a whole variety of reasons why Amazon can do it and no one else can. But I'm sure we all understand why Amazon, out of all people, can, just because they have the money to do so. And the reason why nobody can make money off Android besides Google is the fact that Google has this idea called the Open Handset Alliance, which is very much a monopoly in nature, but labeled in this very interestingly disingenuous way. Oh, look, it's open handset. We support this open system where everyone can do what they want. But is it really? Because if you actually look at the fine print of the Open Handset Alliance, you will find that all the manufacturers that sign up for Google apps, that want to bundle Google services with their handsets, are then not allowed to manufacture any other Android-based systems that don't include Google services by default. And is that not simply the definition of a monopoly? The question is rhetorical. Yes, of course it is. It's so monopolistic in nature that it baffles me that this is just something that they can do. So let's take a step back and talk about Amazon again and why Amazon can do this. When Amazon wants to make its Fire tablets that are based on Android, Amazon has to find a manufacturer that currently doesn't make Google devices and get them to do it. And really the big factories, which are mostly concentrated in China, if there is no financial incentive for them to do so unless they get orders on the amount that Amazon can provide. So otherwise, these manufacturers would much rather just join the Open Handset Alliance and just sell, standard, boring as flimsy phones that can bundle Google services. Obviously, Google services not in China, but that's a whole other question for a whole other day. So the only reason Amazon can do it is because they can order on a scale that makes sense for certain factories to accept this kind of work and rely on this kind of work and do other things, of course, in other places. And so when we go back and talk about, or when I talked about how nobody can make money off Android, that is really what I mean, because no startup, none whatsoever, can really compete with the Open Handset Alliance, because obviously those manufacturers are not allowed to bundle us an alternative Android based system, and no startup has money on the order of Amazon. So by its very nature, by its very business decision, Google has essentially created a monopoly for itself in the handset space. And obviously, we can talk about, what about Apple? Apple certainly doesn't fall under makes sure that Google doesn't actually have a monopoly. But I would argue that that's where we're not really considering things. Just like how Apple has full control of its own ecosystem, Google has very firm control of the software side of that particular ecosystem. And I mean, there are reasons why Google can't really match Apple on hardware. And that's just because they don't they have too much other things to focus on. So when we talk about, the disingenuousness in which Google approaches things, that is really what I mean by hiding under this label of open source and paying lip service to the freedoms and desire for freedom that people seem to have. It's they use it as a very interesting marketing ploy, and some people fall for it and some don't, and that's that's how business works, and that's fine. It's just personally, I probably wouldn't subscribe to that kind of reasoning, simply because I prefer my evil overlords to be upfront about what they're doing. And at least for now, our boys at Cupertino are upfront about their products making money, so they don't have to make money off services. Of course, Apple is going down the services route now, and there are whispers of a Apple owned search engine, but that is all for the future, and we can reevaluate when these particular things change. For now, though, Google is certainly not being very unevil, which, if we will recall, is the company's entire mantra, right? Don't be evil. But that Open Handset Alliance is evil at its best. And I completely forgot I was going to mention this. Another thing where Google is completely evil at its best is, of course, with Chrome, right? And Google Photos. All of these things where it looked really, really, really good when it was first starting. And then, of course, instead of trying to provide a nice service that will keep everyone happy, this is sort of bonus for subscribing, sooner or later they turn into just another way of farming resources, which, I mean, given that they're a corporation, is perfectly legit. It's just, don't hide behind it. And before we go on to Google Photos, Chrome itself also hides under open source, right? And there are certainly more people who are using open source Chromium than there are people who are using open source Android. But having said that, I did a search a few weeks ago, I think, trying to install open source Chromium, and the Chromium project has taken down, as far as I can tell, has taken down the download links for pre-built versions for Chromium, and that's nice, interesting. But at the same time, that's the kind of play that makes me think that they are evil. Well, I mean, in the sense of don't be evil, but do evil things. And so by hiding behind open source again, we're doing all these evil things, right? Chrome itself is a bloated piece of nightmare, almost on par with what Internet Explorer was back in the day, and it just makes me sad. Use Firefox. Come on, guys. But anyway, back to Google Photos. This sort of, I don't want to call it bait and switch, because it really is a legit business decision that they have every right to make. But it's kind of a dick move. Like, you spend so many years. How many years have I personally used Google Photos? 5? No, more than 5. Almost 10 years worth. No, it can't have been 10 years. 5 or 6 years worth of free 1080p photo backup onto Google Photos, only to now tell us within half a year that the old photos don't count, but new photos will start counting towards your storage capacity. And yeah, I understand that storage capacity isn't expensive for anyone, for any of the cloud providers, but that's not really. It's that kind of move where you let the consumer have all these wonderful free things to drive the rest of the business out of business, and then come back and start charging them for it because now you have no more competition. That's the kind of move that's annoying and just it's frustrating, right? It's frustrating, and of course Apple does this to some extent too, but that's more targeted at developers than it is at users. So I'm more inclined to let them sort it out through legal battles, whereas with consumers, it's just the consumers don't have a choice at all, and the average consumer has no idea how to pursue a legal battle on this scale because it's just obviously like it's just all of these things are done within the letter, even the spirit of the law. Oh, we're at 21 minutes. Okay, whoa. In summary, use Firefox. Everyone else is evil. Good night. No, not good night. We'll just end with a yeah. Like normal. Yeah.